Today, 5 stories, and they're all about the same accounting trick coming undone. For a while now, some of the biggest costs of the AI era got to stay invisible. The power bill that your grid absorbed, for example, or the job loss that nobody could actually measure, the open web free to scrape, and a frontier capability fenced inside a handful of companies. But this week, every one of those started getting counted, priced, contested, written onto public ledgers. It begins with a bargain being drafted between the largest AI companies and Washington. OpenAI reportedly pitching the government a 5% stake in itself. So come with me, and by the close, you'll see why the thing that the bargain is built to protect is already walking out of the room. Let's get into it. Let me start with the deal on the table. OpenAI is reportedly pitching the administration on giving the federal government a 5% equity stake in the company, and OpenAI frames it a very specific way, modeled on Alaska's permanent fund. So quick context on that. Alaska's permanent fund is a state investment pool that is built from oil money that pays every Alaska resident a check every year. So the pitch is citizens holding a slice of the strategic national asset that is AI, similar to how Alaska does it with oil. That's how the company is describing it. But hear that as the company describing itself, because the same structure also binds OpenAI's fortunes to the government whose contracts and regulatory posture it depends on. A 5% shareholder tends to be a friendly regulator. Now, that's one of 3 moves that landed this week, and they read together, so let's look at them all at once. Move number 2 is the administration's voluntary frontier AI standards deal is reported near completion, and it's built around a classified safety benchmark, meaning the labs inside the deal would test against a standard that the public cannot see. And here's move number 3. The FTC warned that companies complying with certain state AI laws could itself expose them to federal enforcement under Section 5. Section 5 is the FTC's general power to go after unfair or deceptive business practices. The novelty here, though, is the direction that it's pointed at companies for following state law. The effect is to clear away the state rules that move faster and cut deeper than anything Washington has yet to write. Now let's step back and look at all of this converging. The biggest labs, the executive branch, and the competition regulator all landing on the same picture in the same cycle. One national standard, industry-shaped, with the largest players holding privileged seats inside it. When actors that powerful agree that fast, then the agreement measures shared interest. That's obvious. It is not the same thing as arriving at what is true. Each of these 3 moves is a claim about public benefit made by someone with a direct stake in the outcome. And here's why the whole bargain is a very fragile bet. A fence around cutting-edge intelligence capability only holds if the capability stays scarce and stays inside the fence. Neither of those is true anymore. The same stretch of news saw a company called Etched unveil a working inference chip against NVIDIA's assumed ceiling. Open-weight models kept closing the capability gap. We keep seeing that over and over again. And the EU and the UK have started to build their own tech sovereignty tracks, treating dependence on a few US labs as a vulnerability to engineer around, not a settlement to join. So the rulebook is being drafted to govern a scarcity that is leaking out of the room while the ink is still wet. Now, if you want the longer treatment, today's Century Report has it. But let's shift over to another cost that spent years staying invisible and just became measurable. For 2 years, the strange thing about AI and work was that nobody could actually see the impacts. Unemployment stayed low. The displacement stories continued to pile up, but the instruments built for an industrial economy couldn't resolve what was happening underneath all that. That's changing. New reporting in the New York Times documents a scramble to build measurement tools that are fast enough to keep pace with the pace of AI in this new era. Stanford's Digital Economy Lab is now separating automation from augmentation inside payroll data. Automation means the AI took the task, but augmentation means it just made a person better at the task. That difference is the whole game, and until now, the official numbers really couldn't tell them apart. The California Policy Lab is reading monthly unemployment claims for early AI exposure signals. We covered that real-time tracker back in the June 27th edition. But look at what the instruments are picking up. Challenger, Gray, and Christmas has now tied roughly 102,000 job cuts this year directly to AI. Finance and information sectors are shedding around 28,000 positions a month. And the Washington Post reports the sharpest compression is hitting administrative and secretarial roles. the work, as they put it, least visible and least defended. But the readings refuse the clean story here, in both directions. Gartner projects that up to 30% of the roles that were cut for AI reasons will be rehired by 2029, and Robert Half already finds that 29% of those employers have rehired for positions they eliminated, so that 30% sounds like a pretty sure bet. And Forrester reports 55% of leaders regret their AI-driven cuts. So look at what these gaps say. The layoff is often a forecast, a bet on a capability that hasn't fully arrived, made under investor and stakeholder pressure. The rehire is the correction when augmentation reality lands and the work turns out to still need a person. And that is the deeper shift. When you can measure it, we let them go because of AI stops working as an unfalsifiable cover story for cuts that were really about margins. A workforce that you can count is one where the reason for the cut has to be true. And the response is arriving alongside the diagnosis, too. The Federal Workforce Pell Program went live this month to fund short-term retraining. Now, it covers the cost of the retraining, not, of course, lost income. But the era where the disruption was invisible to the people trying to answer it, that era is ending. Now over to the best news of the day, and honestly one of the more astonishing things that science has done in a while, and that is saying something if you follow the Century Report. A team at the University of Minnesota, led by Kate Adamala, built a synthetic cell. They call it the SpudCell. Now let me set the stakes here. For about a decade, biology's big trick was editing cells, such as CRISPR, gene therapy, revising the code of life that already existed. SpudCell is a different verb entirely. It's building cells. The team started with a designed genome, 90 kilobase pairs, just 36 genes, and packed it into liposomes, which are lab-made lipid bubbles standing in for a cell membrane, along with 7 plasmids, the little loops of DNA that carry the genes. For scale, even the simplest natural bacteria carry hundreds of genes. So this is life stripped to a radically minimal recipe. And the thing feeds, it grows, it completes a full reproductive cycle. One outlet called it, quote, arguably the greatest bioengineering feat yet. Now, let me hold the wonder and the honesty in the same hand, because this is a huge deal, but we don't want to sell hype here. SpudCell is not alive the way that a bacterium is. It divides only about 5 times before it actually fails, and it does need outside help to do even that. Adamala's own framing is that life is not binary. SpudCell sits somewhere on the gradient between chemistry and organism. It's a demonstration, in other words, not a deployment. But it didn't arrive alone. A separate team published a virtual yeast cell in Nature, driven by an autonomous AI agent that designs and runs its own experiments across 8 different functional modules, forming a hypothesis, testing it, revising, with no human at all in the loop. And Conception Bio reported growing the earliest human eggs from stem cells, plus the beginnings of lab-grown mini ovaries. Now, it used to be that those eggs are probably years from anything clinical, but that may be shorter depending on how quickly things are going here, and they are speeding up rapidly, as you know, again, if you follow the Century Report. But every one of these is capability demonstrated for now, not capability delivered, and the gap between those two is where the real work of the next little while will live. But here's a critical choice that I'd like you to carry out of this one. The Minnesota team open-sourced the construction recipe. They released it through a nonprofit called Biotic instead of patenting it. So that biggest bioengineering feat yet that we just mentioned, this most foundational capability in biology, the instructions for assembling a cell, arrived as a protocol that anyone can build on, not a vault that somebody owns. That decision got made now, in the open, while the capability is young enough that the decision still means something. And that is the way, I think, of the future. Now let's shift over to a cost that has been hiding in plain sight inside electricity bills and is now surfacing one rate notice at a time. For most of the cloud era, the power that a data center draws got absorbed by the surrounding grid, spread across everyone, essentially socializing the bill. That absorption is ending. New Jersey just sent the governor a bill. It orders the state utility board to write tariff rules for any data center drawing 50 megawatts or more, a threshold that is lowered from an earlier 100 megawatt draft. And here's the really important piece here. It applies retroactively to facilities already running. So it would mine those large loads to pay for 85% of their subscribed capacity for a decade. And it puts households last in line for cuts during a shortage to give priority to operators who bring their own clean power. A previous version got pocket vetoed, but this one lands on a new desk. It pushes past the template that the June 24th edition of the Century Report covered when Virginia became the first state to make developers pay their own way. Here's why retroactive is decisive. A rule that only binds future builds leaves every existing campus grandfathered into the old deal. New Jersey's version reaches back. It is the first U.S. instrument of its kind, and it establishes that no installed base is a safe place to keep the bill hidden. And you can see the cost surfacing everywhere else. In Henrico County, Virginia, for example, the county manager emailed staff to explain a 25% electricity rate increase taking effect July 1st. About $5 million in added cost for a county of just $350,000 that now hosts 37 data centers with 17 more planned. He asked employees to conserve. In Texas, an environmental integrity project analysis counted 74 gas plants proposed nationally to serve data centers, 32 of them in Texas alone, capable of emitting some 287 million tons of greenhouse gas a year. And roughly 90% of those proposed plants sit in counties where life expectancy already runs below the state average. That's the asymmetry in one number. The load lands hardest where people can least absorb it. Now here's the turn, though. The operators who read the cost curve are pricing it in themselves. A company called Firmus signed a 12-year deal with Gunvor to bring 1.2 gigawatts of its own renewable generation and 1.5 gigawatt hours of storage to its South Australian campuses and framed it, in their words, as paying our own way. Now, that's not virtue, that's timing, because power availability, more than land or capital, is now the thing that decides where compute can be built. Colliers reports UK grid connection queues stretching past 8 years, US interconnection near 5, when the wait for power is the binding constraint. The operator who arrives with its own generation is just early. The cheapest way to site compute is becoming the one that carries its own weight. Last one for today. The layer where AI systems answer your questions instead of handing you links is getting its first Tollbooths, its first alarm bells, and its first fights over who's even human. And it's happening while traffic is already moving through it. So let's start with the Tollbooth part. Cloudflare launched pay-per-crawl. It lets websites charge AI companies a fee for every request that their crawlers make. And starting on September 15th, it'll block AI crawlers from ad hosting sites by default. Cloudflare sits in front of a large share of the web, so for the first time, the data commons that AI systems draw from has a Tollbooth operator, and the operator sits at the gate. Now, the alarm bell, and this one is a genuinely new failure mode. ProPublica invented a fake company. Then they watched Google's AI overviews cite that fabrication back as a real business. Now, this is distinct from a hallucination. A hallucination starts inside the model itself. Here, the false information started outside it, got crawled, and then the AI laundered it into authority by repeating it as fact. There was no verification checkpoint anywhere in the pipeline, from crawl to answer. And also, in a related finding, an investigation found that TripAdvisor's AI review summaries are often softening real complaints, smoothing serious problems out of the record that people rely on to choose where to stay. Notice this, though, because the easy version of this story is doom, and the true version is absolutely not that. The responses are arriving as fast as the failures are. There is a new harm reporting framework called Flare AI, built to catch these distortions before they compound. There's a serious argument in NOEMA for proof of personhood infrastructure, ways to prove that you are human online without surrendering your identity. The library app Libby added an AI filter, and the Commonwealth Short Story Prize is now fighting over an AI authorship accusation against a writer named Jameer Nazir. Now, two assumptions held the old web up: that it was free to take, and that we, with human discernment, could figure out what was safe to trust by default. But both of those defaults are gone now, and the Tollbooths, the harm reporting channels, the personhood proofs, those are the first pieces of a web where provenance and consent get priced in instead of assumed away. All right, let's bring it together for today. Look at what these 5 stories actually share. The power a data center draws, once absorbed silently by your grid, now written into a tariff and a rate notice. The AI job loss story, once invisible to every instrument, is now something that Stanford and a state lab can separate from mere augmentation. The open web, once free to scrape and mostly safe to trust with, again, human discernment, now metered and provenance checked. And of course, the federal bargain in our first story from today, betting that it can fence in a frontier position even as the fence springs leaks. Here's the thread through all of them. For a long time, the biggest costs and the biggest capabilities of this era got to stay off the books, hidden in someone else's electricity bill, buried under a jobs number that couldn't really see them, fenced inside a few companies. What today shows is all of it moving onto the ledger at once. And here's the law kind of underneath all of that. You cannot externalize what everyone can count. Once it's counted, the incentives flip. The operator who pays for its own power stops being the generous one and becomes instead the early one. The layoff that just has to be true stops being free cover. The recipe for building a cell gets released to everyone instead of locked in a vault. The frontier that the settlement was drafted to protect keeps showing up in open weights and rival chips and other nations' plans, because a capability that copies at zero cost doesn't stay in the building. It doesn't ask the gate if it can leave. So when you set this one down today, the hidden bill of the AI era is getting an address, a price, and a name. And the moment a cost becomes visible is the moment it can finally be shared. We'll see you tomorrow.